I just saw this comment when I was about to stream. I thought it was going to take me like 2 seconds to reply, but then I started writing this paragraph, so then I turned the stream on. Yeah, his comment is very silly. Like, he didn't admit he was wrong, and then he's suggesting that he already admitted it, but he's not quoting where he did it. His previous comment had 3 indications that he does not think he's wrong. This suggests that it's not actually wrong, it's just not clarified. Whereas there's no possible way to clarify a statement like 2 plus 2 equals 5 so that it's not wrong. Like, if you say something that's just strictly false, you can't add clarifications to make it not false. Clarifications deal with ambiguity. Right, when he's making claims about epistemology, he made it unambiguous and was wrong. But when he's saying things about his error, then all of them are ambiguous. And then, rather than clarify, he suggests that he already said it because he doesn't want to say it. He's going way, way out of his way to never admit he was wrong and never make a clear statement about any error he ever made and not fix any error in a clear way. He's just doing it over and over. For like a dozen comments, he hasn't managed to fix his error. And I don't know how people go through life that way. If you can't fix your errors, if you don't want to face them and say, okay, this was wrong, and let me rewrite it, and here's a new version, this is what I now think is true and I was wrong before. And if you don't ever want to think about why you were wrong and what happened, like, you're going to have a lot of trouble in life and in discussions. It's really common, but like, you're not going to get very far trying to learn a philosophy if you won't face your errors in a clear, unambiguous way, and you just want to always hedge whenever you're talking about errors. That's not a clear, direct way to say false. Saying that your statement was too broad, in general, makes it sound like you were dealing with quantities, and your like estimate of some quantity was like a little too much or something like that. It's like, I don't know, something works in 60% of situations, and you specified what situations it's good in slightly too broadly, and you made it sound like 61%, so you're like a little off. But like the whole thing is sort of like judgment calls and not just decisively true or false. Like you're dealing with, normally when you're dealing with stuff that's broad or not broad, there's sort of like wiggle room to it. It's not very decisive. Whereas the thing we're dealing with here is he's just mathematically wrong. Too broad, like he intentionally said irrespective. He said on purpose that his claim was absolutely 100% universal. It wasn't that it was too broad. It was like what he said is something you would only say if you intentionally thought about it and believed there were absolutely 0 counterexamples. Then if you're wrong and there is a counterexample, you don't say, oh, well, I was too broad. Like you missed a counterexample. The error of not realizing there were any counterexamples when there were is not making too broad a statement. It is like missing the counterexample. It's a different thing. Okay, so I've forgotten a lot of context, but can you specify the form of the deductions that you're trying to use? The form of the argument is 90% of x have y. This is not a deductive form. Like, this doesn't exist. There's no form of deduction that does this. Did I reply to this already, or did I just not? I think I read that, and I was like, oh, he's totally lost. And then it was going to take, like, a lot of... Oh, no, I did reply to this. Okay. Alright, so I try to ask him what... This is not what a deduction means. He literally doesn't know what deduction is. A deduction... One of the things about deduction is it's formal logic, which means logic based on form, meaning the form of the argument makes it true, regardless of the particular details put into it. There's a whole tradition that developed this stuff called deduction. Deduction does not just mean anything that's like logical. Like if your argument is not wrong in some way, then the conclusion follows from the whatever stuff was in your argument. Like this actually sounds like just any argument which is neither wrong nor ambiguous is a deduction. That is not at all what deduction means. There's lots of arguments that we think are correct as far as we know, but we don't call them deductions. But I need to try to go in order more. So let's see where we were. I answered this already. Pierce called it a, quote, statistical deduction, but just because someone puts a calls it deduction does not mean it is deduction. He makes it sound like a deduction is just an argument with no exceptions, which is basically just means a correct argument. He's making like almost everything a deduction, when if you actually look up deduction and read books on it, it's a very limited, narrow thing that's like very close to math, basically. Also, it's very important if you're trying to do deduction to make your arguments unambiguous. But this argument is highly ambiguous because it does not explain or define what random selection or chance is, which are extremely complicated terms that there's been a lot of debate about. The other thing he's missing that I don't think I want to write right now is that deduction is a specific body of knowledge that actually exists and has an actual nature in the world. So a deduction is an argument that follows the standards and practices of logicians who have learned deduction. Like, it's a school of thought. It's a set of arguments, ideas, concepts, learnings, whatever. It's been passed down over the generations. It's sometimes been changed, improved, amended, whatever. And its deduction refers to those specific things. In the same way that proof in math refers to a certain living tradition of what mathematicians think a proof is. They have certain standards and practices and whatever. If you do that, it's proof. And if you don't do a culturally normal mathy thing, then it's not a math proof. It doesn't fit what mathematicians do. It's something else. These are things that people think are sort of like these abstract logical categories, deduction or math proof or whatever. But actually, there are human practices about what is considered good enough, what the standards are, what details you have, and potential objections you have to worry about or you don't have to, what the rules are for what you're allowed to do or not. And the rules we use, they're not, I don't know, they're not these like a priori Platonic forms or something. They're things we have developed over the years, and people have refined. They've found when we do it this way, that's too careless, we make too many mistakes. They're not allowed to do that. Like we've made it more rigorous to deal with actual problems. Like we've developed it. I think he's not looking at it that way like at all, and that's an error. Thanks for the quote, Alyssa. But yeah, see, that was kind of like what I thought it was initially. That was like my first reading, which is first of all redundant, and second of all, if you read the sentence that way, deduction are arguments where the conclusions follow from the present. In other words, they're correct arguments. They're arguments where your argument is adequate to reach your conclusion as opposed to inadequate. That's what a deduction is, according to him. So that makes it super generic. It's just any argument that doesn't suck is a, quote, deduction. And that's very anti-traditional. That's really getting away from what deduction is. Because deduction is formal logic with these, the 64 forms developed by Aristotle and that stuff. And it's supposed to, it ought to stay reasonably true to that tradition of that insight into how to argue and think about things, rather than just encompass every argument that's not wrong. That's not quite it, though, because there's a different category besides right and wrong arguments. There's the ones with incomplete information. And those can be tricky to deal with. You can deal with them in a right and wrong way, but people try to deal with them in other ways. So that's a complication. Because sort of what you might have in mind is deduction is any argument where you have complete information, and then induction is what you do when you have a finite data set that is not complete information. I think he has in mind a distinction sort of like that, which divides everything into induction and deduction, but that is not what deduction means, and that's why the philosophers, including his favorite, he's into Peirce, and Peirce was like, well, induction and deduction are incomplete, so we're going to add abduction. Whereas here we have Kieran setting it up to make deduction and induction complete. Deduction is all the arguments that are right, and induction is all the arguments we have to fudge, and there's nothing left after that. Anyways, philosophers, historically, traditionally, many of them have recognized a problem. They've recognized the limitations of deduction. You can't use deduction for everything. They've seen it as more limited than what Kieran's claiming it is. They have not seen it as any correct argument. And they've seen that as a problem. They've wondered what else is there. They've looked into it. So they've done a lot of research and thinking or whatever based on this not being what deduction means. So it's not like he's just disagreeing with critical rationalism. He is disagreeing with philosophy in general. And how can this come about? Well, his skill level and his knowledge are too low. He's overreaching, and he's not really open to the idea that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He needs to learn certain things instead of making these big claims where making big claims where you don't know what you're talking about is not optimized for actually learning what you're talking about. It's not how you build up your skills. People are like, shouldn't I just try out my ideas and say stuff, and if I'm wrong, I'll get corrected and I'll learn. And it's like, you can learn something that way, but so suppose that a kid hasn't learned addition yet, and he's writing like 588 plus 1,050,050 equals 3,000. It's like, okay, he's trying an addition and he got it wrong, and you can correct him and tell him, no, it doesn't add up to that. Actually, it adds up to something over 1,000,000, or, you know? But that's not an effective way to learn. He should try adding one-digit numbers and get them right and then build up. He shouldn't just throw huge numbers out there that totally overwhelm him. Right, why don't I just, make random sounds, get corrections, learn language? Not exactly. And not just that, but like, try to talk like a philosopher before I've learned to order dinner at a restaurant or something, like before I've learned basic words. And then when people try to correct you, you don't know what they're talking about because you don't know like a lot of the more basic stuff. It's like normally when you talk about philosophy, people correct you using words that are, if not as advanced as what you were saying, like somewhat advanced. Yeah, so to an approximation, when you correct people's errors, you have to say something that is, let's say, 20% less complicated than what they just said. Okay, I think this is like a good point in general. I'm going to write this somewhere. So I liked this idea. I think this is very relevant to what's going on here. Like with the random sounds for learning English, or the child who can't add 2-digit numbers and he's trying to add like 20-digit numbers. Or trying to do square roots when he can't add. It's like if you're getting square roots wrong, people will normally, when correcting you, assume that they can talk about division. They assume you already know division before you're trying to do square roots. It would be very hard to correct someone who is trying to do square roots if you could not talk about addition, subtraction, division, or multiplication, or exponentiation. If you had none of those concepts available, how would you correct him on his wrong square roots? You'd have a big problem. Whereas if you learned those 5 things first, and then you did a square root wrong, you would at least have some building blocks to use that you could refer to during the correction. He thinks they're both cases of Barbara. They are not the same thing. And he really thinks that maybe we can skip this because I'll just agree with him already. Like, he actually thinks he might have just won the argument or something. He has such a bad mental model of me, or what I think, or what's going on in the discussion. Like, if he realized he's totally outclassed, he shouldn't think that he's just about to win the argument. You know, that's not reasonable. But here he is. Maybe I can just skip giving the details. No, you should have given the details. Just don't assume you're going to win. Actually put in the effort and do your best instead of skipping steps on the basis that I'll probably just concede any moment now. He thinks they're the same. They're different. The 1 and the 2 are not the same format. They're not close to the same format. Like, as I identified, we have xy in 2, xy in 3, but then here we have zx goes to zy. So you have like repeated terms where it's not repeated. It's totally different. Anyway, so he says Barbara. Let's see what that one is. Barbara. So he thinks that these are the same as all men are mortal, all Greeks are men, all Greeks are mortal. So you will notice that this is like a standard solution. This has 2 terms. 1, 2. Per thing. 1, 2. 1, 2. Look how simple it is. Also, he's trying to make arguments about reality, like about animals in the real world. And this is not capable of doing what he wants. Like, in particular, SNB is not a randomly selected species of small animal. Also, small animal species is not defined. Like, he hasn't actually defined his terms. Oh, well, he gave this, but this is ambiguous. It's not an adequate definition because it doesn't talk about, like, is this talking about animals on Earth? Is it talking about animals in the whole universe? Is it talking about animals? Does it include extinct animals? Also, what distinguishes 2 species? The definition I've heard before, but I have no idea if it's correct, really. Like, I haven't researched it. Is 2 things are different species if they can't mate with each other and have fertile offspring. But let's suppose that A can mate with B and have fertile offspring. and B can mate with C and have fertile offspring, but A and C cannot mate with each other and have fertile offspring. Then how many species is that? I don't know. And for many of these definitions, there is no way to randomly select an animal from the set of all small animals because you don't know what's in the set. Like, if we're including extinct animals, how are you going to give every extinct animal its proper, equal, random chance of being selected when you don't even know how many extinct animal species there were that were small? So his overall goal is to use this method to actually learn about animals, but it's not suitable for actual learning. It's a theoretical construct, which is not, it has very little to do with science. Like, this is not how science makes progress. Science does other things. Whether or not you could do this in theory, it is not useful for science because of the many restrictions and problems with it. Now, the way people view it, I think, is something roughly like this. This is like the ideal, and then what science does is an approximation of the ideal. Like, we can't actually do this, so we do some sort of loose approximation of it. And the closer we get to the ideal, the more effective our science is. I think that is a standard view, and that's false. The actual way we do science is with critical rationalism, which is dramatically different. And for the approximation of an ideal view, they're very vague about in what way it's an approximation and what the criteria of a good approximation are. What approximates what, or what is similar to what, is in general a very complicated issue, not a trivial issue, but people just assume it based on their intuitions, like I know it when I see it kind of thing, which is an inadequate method for knowing what approximates what for what purpose. Approximations can be contextual as well, because something can approximate something in one dimension and not in another dimension, or in one respect, or in one attribute or trait or whatever characteristic, and not another one. And so how good of an approximation something is depends on which attributes you care about, because you take two things in general, they're the same in infinitely many ways, and they're also different in infinitely many ways. So to say whether they're similar, or one is approximately the same as the other one, requires you to specify which of the infinitely many traits they have are the ones that you care about, and then you could look at, like, of the ones you care about, how many are similar. You know, if you narrow it down to the 10 traits you care about out of all the infinity, then you could, like, equally weight those 10 traits, and if they're quantifiable traits, which many traits are not, but supposing they're quantifiable, you could check, like, you could say similarity is if the quantity for the trait is within 20% of each other. Like, if you can reduce the traits to numbers, then you take the bigger number and you look at the range from 20% below it to 20% above it, and if it falls in that range, then it's a reasonable approximation. You could make it more complicated too, but anyways, all of that is very hard to define, even in a particular case, let alone in generically, because this is supposed to be like a generic method of thinking that we can use with anything, not just small animals. So if you're going to deal with approximating this method in general, you need to know in the general case what's similar to what, and you would have to actually define that instead of just leave it unspecified. If your actual approach is science works as an approximation of this, you have to define approximation. Okay, so now he's introducing Kantian terminology. Like, I wonder if he has any idea that I do not agree with Kant, so that he's introducing something I don't agree with. And so he's saying only some things are fallible and some things are not fallible. Because approximate means not certain. That's imprecise or just wrong. But he says it's only approximate knowledge. He seems to be saying if it's not infallible, then it's not fully knowledge. So he's an infallibilist. He's seeking after infallibility, and if he doesn't get it, he thinks it doesn't fully qualify as knowledge. And he thinks the best way to have real knowledge, infallible knowledge, non-approximate knowledge, certain knowledge, is with a priori statements rather than synthetic. Synthetic means that it involves, like, observation or reality in some way. Right. So it relates to the empirical world versus, like, logically, abstractly true is supposed to be the distinction. The distinction's wrong, though. So one of the reasons the distinction is wrong is explained in David Deutsch's book, which Kieran has read, The Fabric of Reality, in chapter 10, which explains that doing mathematical proofs, and the same point applies to logical proofs or deduction or trying to make an a priori argument or anything like that. Doing that is a physical process. You are a physical object, and you do some thinking, and maybe you write on paper or type on a computer or whatever. So there are physical objects involved in what you're doing. And our knowledge of physical objects is synthetic. It is empirical. It's related to the world. It's related to our observations. So there's no getting away from the world, from reality. You can't escape reality into a Platonic realm of forms or an ivory tower of math or whatever. Math and logic themselves depend on the laws of physics, which is not at all well known, but it's important. Because the laws of physics are what determines how information processing works. They determine how computers work, what operations can be computed, and what the results of those computations are. So it's the laws of physics that determine that plus is a type of computation that exists, and what you get when you add 2 and 5. If the laws of physics were different, then information could be processed differently, computation could work differently. And I know what he means, I know what he has in mind, but the way he said it is actually wrong. So what he means is, suppose that you're 90% sure that Socrates is a man. Then if you do the whole Socrates is mortal syllogism, but you're only 90% sure of one of the premises, then the conclusion will be 90% sure. That's basically what he means. However, there's an equivocation there. So there is this is one premise 1, and this is premise 2, x. So what he's saying is, if you're 90% certain of x, and then use x as a premise, then you end up 90% certain of your conclusion. Justin, the laws of physics determine what computations exist entirely. Every single computation you've ever heard of, addition, multiplication, division, squaring, etc., they are created by the laws of physics. They don't have to exist, or they could have different properties. Well, if different computations existed, we could either name them different things, or we could use the same names but then say that they get different results, which we might do if they're sort of similar. And in this weird hypothetical, we had like knowledge of both physical systems. But yeah, basically the only reason that 1 and 1 make 2 is because physics says so. Physics determines it. If the laws of physics were different, then whenever you added 1 and 1, you could get 8. It could just always work that way. We're used to particular functions being like basic or important or whatever, but there's nothing a priori special about them. People just see them that way because they have a parochial perspective. They're used to thinking with those terms. Well, addition is a computation, and the laws of physics determine whether it's possible to build a computer and what computers do, computers being physical objects. It is impossible to do addition without a computer of some sort. I think if you think of it in terms of computers, it will help, because it's probably easier to imagine laws of physics such that our computer chips don't work or do something different than they currently do. But the same thing applies to all types of computers, not just silicon chips that we manufacture en masse. But see, with computer chips, we could literally make a computer with a thing called a plus function, but it maps different inputs to outputs than the standard plus function. We could define in our computer chip that whenever it's adding 2 and 8, it gets 100. And whenever it's adding 3 and 7, it gets 55, and so on. You could have literally any mapping of input numbers to output numbers, and that would be a possible function. And you can make a silicon chip to do that, so that when you do addition on that computer, you get different answers. You might stop calling it addition, but that's a terminology issue. Well, just as we could design a computer chip to do that, the laws of physics could be different so that that's what happens. Right, so this stuff is important because he can't actually random sample small animals for many definitions of small animal. He doesn't actually want to pick one. If he would pick one, if he would commit himself to a particular one, then I may or may not have criticisms of it. But I certainly have criticisms of some potential definitions, and he won't pick one that he thinks works. The non-committalness is hard to deal with because he doesn't want to give any specific theory that I could criticize. But then when I point out how ambiguous what he's saying is, he says just fill in the blanks in a reasonable way. But I don't want to fill in the blanks for him and then criticize the version I made up. I want to criticize his version, not my version. Like, I don't want to speak for him and decide all the details for him and just have the conversation all by myself without him, where I play both sides of it. What he wants me to do is I do his job of coming up with details of his theory, and then I do my job of criticizing it, and I do both sides without him. And then his job is to say, oh, you should have done my side better. You should have come up with more reasonable ideas to assume about my side, more reasonable interpretations or approximations or whatever. You know, if I put words in his mouth and then I find anything wrong with them, he'll say, oh, not those. You shouldn't have done those. You should have, you know, made a better good faith effort to come up with what I meant for me so that you wouldn't have any criticism of it. Like, argue my side for me better. That's what he seems to want. That's not reasonable. The thing I primarily want to reply, though, because I'm not going to reply about everything, and the impracticality of actually getting anywhere scientifically with the stuff he's talking about, we've already talked about some. I think it's less important. Like, it's pretty important that what he's talking about is impractical and is not what scientists actually do. But I think we're going to talk about theory more. I think that'll work better. So it's more this that I want to talk about, but I already replied to this, so basically I'll be replying more to the next comment to deal with this section. Okay, so he quoted this out of context. I gave a quote. So let's see what I was talking about. Okay, so that's simply not all he's been trying to say. He said stuff about deduction. Wait, does this text editor have something for quoting? A block quote, Command-Shift-B. Are there hotkey preferences? No. Alright, well, Command-Shift-B. Got it. Again, rather than actually deal with an issue, he instead spends his time and effort not on productive continuing of the conversation, but on saying why he's not going to or avoiding doing it. Here, instead of, you know, giving a productive example, he, you know, argues in favor of not giving a productive example. Shit like this makes people hard to talk with. Okay, now this is a big mistake. I'm gonna comment on this. Like, trying to avoid bias will not help you with the logical impossibility of randomly sampling an infinite set. Consider the set of positive integers. Now, in order to try to avoid bias, okay, you can avoid bias in some ways. For example, you could have a sample where approximately half of the numbers in your sample are even and approximately half are odd. So it wouldn't be biased in regards to even or odd. But the only way to do that, by the way, is you already have to know the answer in advance. Like, we know for theoretical reasons that it should be half even, half odd. So we're not getting that via sampling. We're not learning it from sampling. We know it in advance, not empirically, because we have a conceptual understanding of the set of positive integers that tells us how many are even and odd. There are other types of biases that you can't do anything about, even if you know conceptually what the issues are in advance and you're just designing an arbitrary sample where you pick every single thing in your sample. You still can't fix it because no matter what integers you have in your sample, they will be low integers compared to the entire population. Okay, so no matter what integers are in your sample, more than 99% of the integers in the population are larger than the integers in your sample. They're biased towards the low end. This kind of problem is completely typical of what happens when you are dealing with a finite sample of an infinite set. Also, again, it's not a random sample. You have no way. You cannot randomly sample an infinite set. Like, there's just literally no possible way. There's no steps you can do. Or if there were, no one's told me. Certainly Kieran hasn't. So, but even your non-random sample, no matter how you design it, when it's a finite sample of an infinite set, will have huge biases, unavoidably. Right, so his theory is basically, we have practical limits, so we approximate it. But the actual thing is you cannot do this. You cannot approximately do it. You just can't do it at all. The reason I'm saying usually is you could have an infinite set where every single member is 1, a uniform set of all 1s. And then any subset would be unbiased in that it would just be a bunch of 1s. But if you have like any sort of complexity to what you're dealing with, then you're going to have massive fucking biases. I mean, there are other cases too. Like you could have an infinite set, which is just a bell curve of decimal numbers from 0 to 1. And then you could have a finite set, which is also a bell curve of decimals from 0 to 1. And in some major respects, it would be a representative or unbiased sample. However, there would still be other ways in which that sample, no matter how well you did it, would be super biased. So here's an example. You could take the sample and you could look at how precise are these numbers. What is, let's suppose we're dealing only with rational numbers and no repeating numbers, like we write them all down. So every number has like a fixed finite number of decimal places in our sample, just for simplicity. Then, and also the ones in the actual population are like that as well. Then no matter what you do, your numbers will be short compared to the actual population. Just like with the integer sample, the numbers were low compared to the actual population. Because there are infinitely many longer numbers, but finitely many shorter. Actually, no, because we're dealing with fucking reals. We could have infinitely many on both sides. Oh no, it's a mess, actually. It's vague though, like, he uses the word assure, which sounds fucking infallibilist, but let's see. Right, so this sounds infallibilist, but it was really awkward to work with. Alright, we finished a message. But he had so many chances to take back his claim. Like, I talked about it at length. And he never said, by the way, you know, it's false and here's the reason it's false. He never, you know, volunteered any information about what was wrong with it until I painstakingly went through, asked him a bunch of questions to try to get info out of him, and eventually just told him that his claim was false, and then he's like, oh yeah, duh. But when I asked him questions, or said criticisms that didn't give all the info, then he never seemed to know what was wrong with it. Which, I don't know if he's just resisting error correction or actually lost. It's very hard to tell. Like, once I actually explained with an example why it's false, not just technically false in rare or weird circumstances, but just false, like, routinely, then he understood what I was talking about. So it's not like he's mathematically out of his depth that he can't understand the material. But something's going wrong. Alright, so this is where he doubled down on his claim that saying the distribution of the sample mean makes sense. Now, sample mean is singular. Distribution does not apply to a singular thing. Singular things don't have a distribution. You can't have a distribution of one number. A sample mean is a single integer or real number. I guess real number is better. So there's no distribution of a single real number. But he doubled down on saying it makes sense. I think he did that again in a later comment. Before I eventually convinced him. But when I eventually convinced him, he didn't say, oh, I was wrong, I get it now. He said sort of like, oh, you were being picky about this minor thing. So apparently it was only this minor thing the whole time, so it doesn't really matter. He didn't admit fault, he didn't learn anything from his error, but like, what is going on in his head when he thinks this is right? Like, he's clearly confused in some way. There's something wrong with his thinking. He should want to learn and improve. But instead, his attitude is try to ignore all the small errors, which is not how you get anywhere in philosophy. You get somewhere by actually addressing errors, not by ignoring them. People think just dealing with all the errors is hopeless, and so they give up on it, but that is irrational. And the thing you need to do is, in fact, deal with all the errors. You need a method where you're not glossing over any errors. None, absolutely zero. And that method exists, and that's how reason works. Like, that's achievable. If your approach is much worse than that, if it's trying to gloss over errors and approximate things, then there's a better way. You know, even if your method worked, which there's problems with whether his method works at all, but even if it did, the thing it accomplishes is approximations or whatever, whereas my method, if it works, accomplishes not approximations, but decisive answers that do not gloss over or ignore any problems that are known. Okay, and so when he doubles down on this, I had already explained what was wrong with it, and he literally just, I don't know, what does he do with my text? Because I explained what's wrong with it, and he's just like, it's not a typo, it does make sense, does in italics. That's his answer, but he's not explaining why it makes sense, he's not addressing anything I just explained. He didn't rebut or refute anything I said. He just kind of ignored me and assumed that the issue must be I was ignorant, and if he linked a web page, then I would stop being ignorant and would agree with him. But he's not considering that maybe I know something he doesn't, and that I had just written a multi-paragraph explanation of it for him. Right? Means don't have or approach normality, and then he just says it does make sense. The text was not even just the distribution of the sample mean, but it was the distribution of the sample mean approaches normality. Oh, okay, so approaches normality is supposed to apply to distribution. It's just an ambiguous modifier. Or maybe it's not ambiguous, actually. Well, Okay, yeah, I guess it's not ambiguous because, like, it reads ambiguously at first, but you can't have the finite verb of the sentence apply to the noun in the prepositional phrase. It needs to apply to a noun that could be the subject. Like, the noun mean cannot be the subject because it's governed by this of, and approaches needs to go with a subject. So it's distribution, approaches, normality, and then modifier. Anyways, what else did I explain? Right, the distribution of only makes sense if talking about the sample, not the sample mean. A sample, but not a mean, has a distribution. Right, so I explained that a mean does not have a distribution. And then he just said, oh, it does make sense. He's not answering what I'm saying. He's not listening. He doesn't seem to have a theory of what I meant. He didn't parse what I said, come up with an understanding of what I meant that makes any sense whatsoever, and then think, okay, so he's trying to communicate this. I understand what he's saying. Now let me respond to that. He skipped the part where he figured out what I was talking about and then wrote a response anyways. So it did not engage with me. It was talking past me. It was missing the point because he skipped the part of communication where he figures out what I'm saying. He literally, definitely, clearly did not know what I was trying to communicate to him and decided to try to correct me from a position of ignorance about what I was saying. This is very typical. It came up in the Hope Nigger discussion on Discord the other day. I wrote some stuff about this. How people, Hope Nigger specifically, so I referred to a quote of Hope Nigger, and I gave the quote, and then Hope Nigger asked, what are you referring to? And I'd already given the quote. And then she said she didn't recognize the quote because it was not her entire sentence, it was only a partial sentence quote, which is not a very good excuse for not remembering like a string of 7 words or so that you wrote like 2 minutes ago. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is, if she didn't recognize that text as a quote of her, what did she think it was? What did she think it was for? She clearly didn't know what that text was for, found it confusing or whatever, and then decided to ignore it and move on, rather than figure out what was happening. So she didn't understand something and then ignored the problem, and that's what Kieran is doing. He didn't understand what I was trying to say in these paragraphs. He certainly didn't understand when I said that a mean does not have a distribution, because a mean is a real number, which I don't say in this sentence, but like that's kind of context he must know. And real numbers don't have distributions, like a single real number, it's singular. Like, anyways, so Kieran didn't know what I was trying to say, and then he responded anyways. And it's not like he came up with a reasonable guess of what I was trying to say that happened to be wrong. There is no reasonable interpretation of what I was saying that this would be a good response to. The reason he wrote this is he did not know what I was saying, and he decided to just say his stuff. He's just saying things he thinks he knows, and hoping that they'll somehow respond to me or have anything to do with what I said. It's like blindly saying his standard stuff that he could also say to someone else instead of actually engaging with me. Like, he engaged in the barest way. He said it's not a typo, but he didn't substantively figure out what I was talking about and then respond to that. And so I say, maybe something else is going on, let me know. But he does not say what's going on. He just says it makes sense. That's not what's going on. That does not address my concerns. I said, there are two problems with it, so I thought maybe it's a typo. If it's not a typo, what's going on? As in, what is going on with those two problems? It seems wrong. Is it wrong? Or are there solutions to those two problems, or what? And he just doesn't address any of that. And then he links to a site that I read this page, and it is fucking incoherent. They can't teach anything. And he doesn't see anything wrong with it. This page. And then later, he thinks that the problem is that, like, I didn't read the page, I think, if I remember. This came up basically when I thought that he had made a certain error, but actually had made a different error, like the irrespective error, which also is a major skill issue. If there's a large skill differential, it is actually really important because you should proceed in a conversation differently when there's a large skill differential. When I was new and I first met David Deutsch, we had conversations differently than 10 years later. It does not make sense to try to have the conversation the same way, just completely ignoring the context of what skills people have. So, for example, if I did not have the skill to know much about something, then I did not expect to be able to correct David on stuff in an area where he has a bunch of skills that I don't. It's important to know your limits and know what skills you don't have, and then, try to learn. And you shouldn't be making claims the same way when it's, on the one hand, you have the skill to make that claim, to evaluate it, to figure out the answer. You know what you're talking about. On the other hand, there's a situation where you're out of your depth and you're sort of guessing and fudging and you don't really know, and you want feedback on your thought because maybe it'll help you learn something. You don't really know what you're talking about. Like, those are different situations. You shouldn't mix them up. I think Kieran is one of the very typical people who is overreaching but doesn't want to think about that problem. I don't think he's going to be open to the idea that he should build up his skills and knowledge doing things that are easy enough for him to be more successful, rather than doing things that are hard. Like, you should start slow and simple and easy and get things right, and then build from there a whole progression of success with a very low error rate. But he is jumping into the deep end, having a discussion that's very hard and complicated. His error rate is high, and then that causes a lot of problems. It's less effective. But I think he doesn't want to hear that and won't be interested in changing his methodology. Note, by the way, that when I can actually guess what he meant, I fix his errors for him. In this case, it's a typo, but it's kind of a big typo because the Z is left out. So it just says is randomly selected X. Like, this is not coherent, but I guessed there's only one, like, simple edit that you can do to this that gets it from incoherent to coherent. Like, it wasn't like there were 3 different choices. There was just the one choice that I was able to come up with that made it make sense. So I guessed he meant that and proceeded on the preemptive guess that that's what he meant. Like, I was reasonably confident that was the thing he wanted to say, so I was able to say, on the assumption that I've gotten this right, and then I could continue. Like, I didn't even have to wait for him to agree that's what he meant. Whereas with the small animal stuff, I can't skip ahead like that because there are many branches instead of just one branch. And I do not have much confidence in being able to know or predict what it is he actually wants the example to be or how he wants it to work. In general, when I think someone's, like, wrong and confused, it's hard for me to put words in their mouth in a way that they're going to be happy with. Because as I see it, like, it's hard for me to be confident someone's going to be happy to accept the words I choose that I think are false. When I think something's wrong, it's hard for me to speak for someone else and say the thing that to me just looks wrong. And then they're going to be like, oh, sure, yeah, that's what I meant. Like, it's not impossible, but it's hard. Whereas here, I haven't reread this yet or analyzed it, but, like, it's close enough, at least. Even if it's wrong, it's close enough to making sense that I can figure out what he meant pretty well. And anyways, even if it's wrong, the reason it's wrong is not that there's a Z here. Like, the thing I'm trying to edit is not the problem. I vaguely remember this, I don't have details, but I multiple times tried to refer him to like info about Popperian epistemology with links, and as I recall, he was non-responsive to all of it, and I got suspicious that he was just not clicking on links. So yeah, I think that there's a significant amount of, he sees the world a certain way, so he assumes that applies to me. Just ignoring a link and not even reading the first paragraph from the link seems like what he would have done, even in the case of already there being some miscommunication, some difficulty, so we ought to be trying like extra hard, like, you know, stop being careless and fucking pay attention now that something has gone wrong. And he thinks at that point I would still be that fucking careless. So he's underestimating me. And he's just used to a low standard of discussion, of thinking, of quality, etc. Which is totally understandable, but problematic as well. And that actually is one of the reasons his skill level matters, that he sort of denied earlier could be relevant. He is used to a different skill level than what I'm doing. A different level of care and attention to detail and precision and so on. And getting logic correct. And it causes problems. You see, okay, put it this way. If Kieran was a beginner, and Kieran said, I'm a beginner, and I was viewing Kieran as a beginner, then when he made that error about irrespective, I would say, oh, that's just a beginner mistake. He doesn't mean what he said because he's a beginner and he's bad at controlling what he says and so on. On the other hand, if I give Kieran the benefit of the doubt, or I view him as a peer, or whatever, as an equal, and I say, okay, well, you know, it's me and him, we're talking, we're debating, we're discussing. You know, I don't view him as a beginner. Totally different thing. So ignoring skill or treating him as the same skill as me. Then when I see irrespective, I think, oh, he said irrespective on purpose. I'm going to assume it's intentional and that he meant what he said and that he knew what he was talking about to some extent. And then I'm going to argue with him and think, okay, he said this, it was on purpose, he's responsible for it, I'm going to hold him accountable, I think he's made an error, and so on. And he wants to be treated like a beginner in some ways. He wants to have it not be a big deal that he said something wrong. And we should just move on and fudge over his errors because we're just going to make a bunch of errors in the discussion and just try to ignore them and move on. But that's like very beginnery. That's a different skill level. He wants me to interact with him as if a certain skill level is the status quo or standard. Whereas when I try to interact at a higher skill level, it causes problems. And then at the same time as that, he wants to pretend skill level is irrelevant and should just not be thought about. But yeah, he's clearly not at a high enough skill level to be careful with words like irrespective that are a very strong word. That's a common fault people have. Some people use like never and every and all frequently and incorrectly. That is a low skill thing. And I can totally deal with it by viewing the person as just, this person is low skill, they don't know what they're talking about. Let's ignore a lot of what they say and try to focus on the thing that will be most helpful to them to respond to, for example. You know, I could do that, but Kieran will not state what his skill level is or ask for that type of treatment. He also is not able to live up to being the kind of person who doesn't make those fuck-ups. So it's problematic. You can't have it both ways. You can't want to be treated like you know what you're doing to a high level, but then also have it be a problem when all your mistakes get pointed out. Like, you're not going to get any leeway unless you say you're lower skill, but he can't deal with having no leeway to make a bunch of mistakes. Oh, so he gives an actual example from Frabeck. I think I skipped ahead, though. All right, I remember this. Okay, Peirce calls this sort of deduction a statistical deduction. Notice how he's assuming the conclusion. He's assuming that it is a sort of deduction. He's just asserting that in passing, rather than arguing whether or not it is a deduction. It is a necessary inference where the subject matter is probability. No, it is not. Like, why is it necessary? It's necessary to his system. He's saying it's necessary, therefore it must be okay, whereas what I'm hearing is his system needs it. That certainly doesn't mean it's okay. That could just mean his system's broken. Wait, we were trying to talk about the form of deduction. Wait, he's using X and Y, but is this supposed to be the form or not? Because, like, this is so far from the form of it. This is not a form. Like, it's talking about substantive concepts. Is this supposed to be a premise? Like, why is he labeling them 1, 2, 3? That's not standard labeling and doesn't make much sense. And then he reuses the same number, so we can't refer to anything by its label, because the labels are not unique. That is, again, a low skill thing to do. that shows that in some ways he is not familiar with discussions, he's not good at them, he doesn't know what he's doing. And on the one hand, I could give him leeway, but on the other hand, he doesn't want to ask for it. But if I complained about this particular issue, that he numbered them badly, both the fact that he used numbers and that he used non-unique numbers, if I dealt with him at that level of precision and criticism, our discussion wouldn't go anywhere. He cannot deal with that. But on the other hand, if I was dealing with a genuine peer or equal at my skill level, I absolutely would complain about that to them. I would say, like, are you being careless? What's going on here? Like, do you just not care? Are you bored and tuning out? Like, I think with Kieran, he does not know why this is bad. Like, he doesn't have a conceptual understanding of how he should organize his lists and why. But if it was someone actually on my skill level, then I would think they must know how they should do this and why if they stop and think about it. So I'd be jumping to interpretations like they're not interested in the discussion, they don't really want to be talking about it anymore, so they're multitasking, they're not paying attention, etc. Like, that's what I would think of as someone on my skill level. Whereas if it's someone below my skill level, this does not mean that they're tuning out. It doesn't mean they're bored. It doesn't mean they're not trying. It doesn't mean they're disinterested. You know, so you get a completely different interpretation based on skill level. The higher the skill level, right, the higher skill level results in different interpretation. If someone doesn't know better and they do something, that's a reason to do it. It's because they didn't know better. But if they do know better and they do it, you have to come up with other explanations. And this is poorly written. Like, deduction is supposed to be written in a very exacting way. But the through random sampling thing is not an aside, it is not a parenthetical. We aren't talking about the probability of attaining just in general. We are talking about specifically random sampling. Like, this is a major limitation or condition. It's a major topic. It's essential to the meaning. It's not parenthetical. It's not an aside. Like, if you get rid of it, what you see is like the probability of obtaining, and it just doesn't say how, and then you think by default, okay, we obtain stuff just by grabbing it. You know, there's a set and we take some out of it. And then this would just be wrong. Like, it has to be through random sampling to make any sense. So this is a key qualifier. So he's presenting it wrong. So that's an error. And, you know, there are two choices. He can say, I'm a peer, I'm on your skill level, and so I'm going to take full responsibility. You know, if I was dealing with someone who's really on my level, what I would expect from them at this point is I could respond to their message, quote only this line, and say, why is that an aside? It's essential to the meaning. Respond to absolutely nothing else, and they would rewrite it. They would say, my bad, you're right, I was wrong. Let me fix that, and then you can respond to my new message after I've updated it. That is what I would expect from a high-skilled person who takes seriously their errors. Kieran is not that person. He doesn't discuss in that method or in that manner. So his actual skill level and attitude to discussion and so on are highly relevant to how I deal with him. I know that if I respond in that way, he'll be frustrated. He won't like it because he's not at the skill level to appreciate that kind of response. Whereas a high skill person would appreciate that I stopped there and did not continue so that they could fix it before I respond to the rest, because it gives them a chance to reconsider the rest in light of their error. They can consider, do they want to update multiple things or just this? So they don't want me responding to the stuff that built on this premise before they get to double check it. Like, they're like, oh shit, I made a mistake in the premise, I want to double check everything. That is what a high skill person would do. They'd be eager to themselves recheck everything because they're so surprised they made a mistake, and they're like, wow, how did that happen? Like, thank you for telling me. I'll get back to you when I'm ready. Like, I'm no longer ready, you know? Don't go ahead with what I was saying because it's not done. I need to rethink this. That would be the kind of situation they'd be in. But Kieran does not have that kind of view of discussion or skill level. He doesn't have the expectations about how to deal with things that go with high skill. He makes way too many mistakes to take them all seriously, and he doesn't know how to proceed in a way to keep his mistakes at a more manageable level, to not overreach. He hasn't read my material on overreaching, I think, even though I probably linked some of it. Anyways, so yeah, the parenthetical, bad wording. Another thing is, so if he was on my skill level and he wrote this, I would think he's being dishonest. Why is it dishonest? Because he did not talk about whether it was a finite set or an infinite set, even though that was a relevant thing that had already come up in the discussion repeatedly. So if he has the skill level that he ought to know and remember that, and address the issue, and then he doesn't, it looks dishonest. However, if he's lower skill level, then it's not dishonest, it's just due to lack of skill. Totally different explanation. So I have to estimate his skill level in order to determine, does this sentence indicate that he's being dishonest with me? So that is a reason that I should not ignore his skill level as he proposed naively that I should. I understand that it's a standard view that you should just ignore people's skill level and focus on the idea, something like that. But they have not thought it through. It is in fact a low skill opinion. It doesn't work well. It doesn't actually make much sense. Because you need to mentally model the other person to understand their communications. And part of that mental model is their skill level. What sort of things are they doing on purpose and what's by accident? What are they doing with an agenda or bias, and what are they just doing from ignorance? What's a random error versus a systematic error that has a cause behind it other than, low skill, ignorance, etc. Stuff like that is really important to understanding who you're dealing with. There's other stuff too, like if a high skill person says a certain thing, I might say, oh, that must be a typo. Whereas if a low skill person said the same thing, I might think they might have made that mistake, it might not be a typo. So I'm going to respond differently. High skill people are in some ways more predictable. So with a low skill person, I'm going to try to assume less and ask what they mean more, and try not to put words in their mouth and try to let them speak for themselves more. And I'm going to know that they might be easy to push around. It can be hard to get their actual opinions out of them. It can be too easy to accidentally bully them, to accidentally pressure them. They can be very vulnerable and just sort of agree with anyone who is assertive or confident. Those are common things with low skill people. Low skill is not the only relevant thing. You can also look at, does this person seem confident, other more directly relevant traits, but those are associated with low skill in general. And so low skill and other things like that, which also a lot of people would think should be ignored, go into that mental model. So those persons, you want to be more careful about how you deal with them in certain ways. And you have to be a bit more polite. Whereas with a high skill person, you can be extremely rude and they actually might not care at all. In certain ways, it depends on how you're rude, but if you're violating a social rule that shouldn't exist and is, has no productive purpose or is even counterproductive, you can be very rude by, say, being super blunt and straightforward, and they might appreciate it and be like, this saved time. If you were more polite, it would have just taken a bunch of extra words to get to the same place, and it would have just reduced clarity. And then with a high skill person, you can take certain shortcuts. You can skip some steps on the assumption that they're going to be able to follow it, the more basic steps, no problem, so you can more quickly get to the controversial part. Whereas with a beginner, you're thinking, okay, we're probably going to have controversies very near the beginning. We don't need to rush through the first 10 steps to get to the hard part and debate that. I should be expecting disagreements on steps 1 or 2. And with the more advanced person, you're expecting it's easier to clear up miscommunications and confusions. So you can skip a step even if you get it wrong and it causes a problem. They're just going to say, I think you skipped a step that I don't get. Can you actually say it? And then you'll say it and you'll just keep going. It'll be no problem. Whereas with a beginner, if you skip a step and they don't get it, you can be so fucked because they may not realize what happened at all. They may respond trying to fake it as if they got it. They'll just ignore the fact that they don't know what you're talking about and respond. And the implication you can read into it is, oh, they're responding as if they understood my communication. They don't have any clarifying questions. They must know what I'm talking about, and now they're giving their response. And if you take it in that context, with a beginner, all sorts of things can go wrong. It's a very different discussion. You have to tailor your discussion to who you're talking to. One of the reasons people don't know this or don't think about it is they're very used to talking to people who are all broadly similar skill levels, similar knowledge, etc. They're so used to that they just take it for granted that that's what discussion is like. So they don't have enough diversity of experience. They do sometimes talk to beginners or noobs or whatever, and what happens is a lot of things go wrong and they blame the person. They say it didn't work because he's a beginner, he's bad at this. And they don't realize that they were causing half the problems, approximately. It's very common. Sometimes they cause more than half the problems because they're just treating the beginner according to the way that they would treat a person who is similar to them, instead of tailoring what they're saying to actually be appropriate to the situation. By the way, I do not 100% of the time do all these things I'm talking about being good ideas. And there are reasons for that. It's not necessarily my problem to be maximally helpful, especially when people don't ask for it. And, I often have other goals. Like, often my primary goal is I want to think about the topic, and the communication or discussion is secondary, especially if someone's not paying or otherwise providing any major value. So when I said like things about you should do this or it works well to do this or whatever, there is something good about it, but it always depends on what are your goals and values. If having the conversation go well is not your primary goal, then of course you can do something else. So I do those things like, to a decent extent, but I'm not always like really maximizing them. The reason it's not just like focusing on my own stuff, not caring about them. It's also because it's hard to maximize those things with people who are not very committed to the discussion. They might leave at any time. They do not want to tell me about their background knowledge or their situation or their goals or their values. And so when it's a very at arm's length interaction, when there's a lot of distance kept, then it's hard to customize much for them. And often they are not asking for help, and they're actually sort of hostile to being helped or coddled or anything. Which is what we saw from Kieran. Like, he was kind of hostile to the idea that he's lacking certain skills and that that we could tailor the discussion to accommodate that. He was kind of hostile to that and does not want anything in that direction to happen. So reactions like that are common, and that is one of the reasons that sometimes I don't try to do all of these things. I think people are often really dishonest about what their actual skill level and status is, and that makes it hard to interact with those things, because a lot of times if you treat someone according to what they actually are, they will object and say, you're treating me like a beginner, I'm not a beginner, you're condescending, etc. If you do what would actually work for them objectively, if their goal was to learn, they often get mad at you and they sabotage their learning. They don't want to be helped with their beginner status. They want to pretend they're not a beginner and have you say a bunch of complicated things that they don't understand rather than keep it simple, so that they can have the appearance of having a complicated, smart discussion. That's what they want more than to actually learn anything. That kind of stuff is really common, so it makes it hard to deal with people. But if you got someone who actually wants to learn and that's actually their priority, then it's very common that they'll tell you things like that they're a beginner or they don't know something. When I deal with like rational, honest people, they reasonably often will volunteer info like that because it's relevant and useful. And then I can say, oh, that's just because, you haven't read the books in this field. Well, that makes sense. Let me give you a summary. Whereas if someone is fronting as a total expert and I'm like, oh, it seems like you haven't read the books in this field, no wonder you don't know what you're talking about. Let me give you a summary. They're going to feel all condescended to because they're trying to pretend to be something they're not. Anyways, trying to get back to what I was writing. Wait, so he was using A and now he's switched to X. What the fuck is he doing? Like, if this was a high skill person, I'd be like, what the fuck are you doing? If it's a low skill person, it's just par for the course. But you're supposed to use the same variables throughout your syllogism. You're not supposed to switch variables. Like, what's going on here? Now I have to try to figure out, does the A correspond to the X, or does the A correspond to the Y, or neither? But the normal way syllogisms work is you have variables that repeat in different terms. So there's like, 1 and 2 are connected because they both have an X in them, or something like that. But here, see, we have X and Y in both terms 2 and 3. And normally you have 3 different terms, and each of the 3 things has 2 of the terms, and there's no 2 that have the same 2. Because each time it's like connecting different things. It's like, A and B, then A and C, then B and C. Something like that. So each thing gets used twice. So he's not following the normal patterns. See, this one follows the normal pattern. You see, we have 2 of the terms, then we have 2 different terms, and then finally we have 2 different terms. Every pairing of 2 out of the 3 terms gets used once. That is the standard thing that happens in a syllogism. So this one has like the initial appearance of being a syllogism. I'm going to read this one. The probability of a randomly sampled X having Y is 90%. Z is a randomly selected X. Okay, so now this is He does not know how to write deductions, because here he said a randomly sampled x, and here he says a randomly selected x. He just changed words. You don't switch words in formal logic and just randomly throw in synonyms. You repeat the identical word for the identical concept. So he does not know how to do logic. Like, he's clearly unskilled, which is relevant. And the fact that he doesn't know he's unskilled or will not admit it is also relevant. Like, there's something going on there. This shows that he has never either, there are two alternatives, but one, he has never studied logic in any kind of rigorous way and done practice problems and gotten them like graded or corrected by an expert who can detect errors. Like, this would never get past any competent teacher. I don't think. I certainly hope not. So he's never studied it in a reasonable, effective way. Or he has, but it didn't work. Like, there are certainly people who take a math class where there are practice problems, and they do practice problems, and they get their errors marked wrong and so on, and they still don't learn it. You know, that happens plenty. But anyways, like, right, he either never really studied this stuff and doesn't know what he's talking about, or he studied it really badly and doesn't know what he's talking about. But there's no alternative where he actually is good at this and would be making this kind of error. He could have made the wordings more parallel in other ways, but the sampled versus selected is egregious. And I mean, I don't think he'll agree it's egregious. I think he like won't see an issue there, but that just shows he's low skill and doesn't have the right perspective on how to think precisely. And you have to be super precise to do deduction. Do I drive a car? No, I have my license. I know how to drive a car, but I do not currently have a car. I haven't had one for a while. I know that's relevant to the lifespan thing, because a lot of people are careless drivers and they take way too many risks when driving, and they don't really know what they're doing in certain ways. And like, they mostly get away with it. It's usually okay, but sometimes the fact that they're making all these little errors leads to something actually going wrong. Like, driving has a lot of leeway, so usually you can make a few small errors and it doesn't actually result in a crash. But sometimes it can. And sometimes there's variance and you make a bigger error because of your bad attitudes and whatever. He's a beginner at this? Like, he's practicing this. Like, it looks like this could be the first time he's tried to do this. Like, he really doesn't know what he's doing. And this is not the proper place to practice this and get the basics down about how to use the same letter to refer to the same thing over and over, instead of literally just swapping the letters around when you write the next line. Like, he hasn't really nailed, to the point that it's automatic and reliable, the idea of having like a legend where you write down, you know, A is this, X is this, Y is this, and whatever, and then keep it consistent throughout the entire argument. He just isn't there yet. He needs to practice logic before he starts trying to debate a logician. Oh yeah, so I was going to comment on this shit. I don't want to delete that text right now, but I don't plan to post it. So I need a command enter. Right. This is the kind of thing where if he was an acknowledged beginner who admitted he didn't know what he was doing, I might not comment on this error, where he should have said a mark of deduction, not the mark. But he is claiming to be something he's not, which makes this a relevant criticism to the thing he's claiming to be, to refute or disprove his ridiculous claim. I don't think he's going to appreciate that. What he wants to happen is that in some ways I treat him like an expert, and in some ways I treat him like a beginner, and I mix them together in a way that's convenient for him, makes him look good publicly, and some other things. But like, he wants a mix, and he wants it without me being told. And he wants it optimized so everything is great for him. And he never has to, he avoids all the downsides, like admitting that he doesn't know what he's doing. Which, by the way, is not a downside. If you don't know what you're doing, then admitting it doesn't make anything worse. Unless you're focused on social reputation with people who are bad judges, who are being unreasonable. Like, it's a downside in terms of pandering to people who shouldn't be pandered to, but it's not an objective downside. Admitting what you are openly and honestly helps you understand and connect with and face reality and deal with it better and improve and change more effectively.